In the year 1609, when Henry Hudson's ship sailed up the river that now bears his name, he did not know he was opening the door to the first great business of New York, the fur trade. That single voyage set in motion a chain of events that would shape the destiny of a region, a people, and a future city. Before New York became a city of finance, skyscrapers, and immigrants, it was a wilderness. The forests were thick, the rivers wide, and the land was home to native peoples who had lived there for centuries. Yet in those forests lived animals whose pelts were prized across Europe. Beaver fur, soft and durable, was in high demand for hats and garments. This demand created opportunity, and opportunity created conflict. We will uncover how the fur trade became the first major business of New York, who controlled it, who fought for it, and what consequences followed. Let us begin with Hudson's voyage. In 1609, sailing for the Dutch East India Company, Hudson was searching for a passage to Asia. He did not find it. Instead, he found a river, rich lands, and native peoples willing to trade. Hudson's crew exchanged beads, knives, and cloth for furs. It was a small exchange, but it was the spark. What comes next? The Dutch realized that this land could be more than a failed route to Asia. It could be a source of wealth. And so, the fur trade began. The Mohawk and Mohican tribes were among the first to trade with the Dutch. They had long hunted beaver and other animals, but now their furs had new value. The Dutch offered iron tools, firearms, and cloth in return. For native peoples, these goods changed daily life. For the Dutch, the furs opened doors to profit. Native groups began to rely on European goods, and soon rivalries grew. The Mohawk sought to dominate trade routes. The Mohican resisted. Conflict was inevitable. In 1621, the Dutch West India Company was formed. Its purpose was clear: control trade in the Americas. By 1624, Dutch settlers arrived at Fort Orange, near present-day Albany, and Manhattan. These forts were not built for farming, they were built for fur. The fur trade was no longer a casual exchange. It became organized, regulated, and protected by military force. The Dutch West India Company claimed monopoly rights. Traders had to work under its authority. But what did this mean? It meant that the fur trade was not only business, it was politics, and politics always brings controversy. Let us pause here. Why call the fur trade the first major business of New York? Because before farming, before shipping, before finance, fur was the lifeblood. It was the reason forts were built. It was the reason alliances were made. It was the reason wars were fought. Every beaver pelt carried across the Atlantic was more than fur. It was currency. It was power. It was survival. We have seen the beginning, the spark of Hudson's voyage, the arrival of Dutch settlers, the role of native peoples. But what happens when more nations enter the game? What happens when the English arrive? What happens when native tribes fight for control? The answer is coming. But first, let us look deeper into the early Dutch years. At Fort Orange and New Amsterdam, daily life revolved around fur. Traders waited for native hunters to arrive with pelts. Negotiations were tense, prices shifted, trust was fragile. Imagine the scene. A Mohawk hunter enters the fort with bundles of beaver skins. A Dutch trader offers cloth and iron tools. The hunter hesitates. He knows the French in Canada also want his furs. He knows the English in New England are watching. He must decide. This moment of choice happened again and again, and each choice shaped the balance of power. The Dutch West India Company wanted control, but independent traders often broke the rules. Smuggling was common. Some traders sold furs secretly to avoid company taxes. Others traded directly with native groups outside official posts. This created controversy. Was the fur trade a free business, or was it a monopoly? The debate was fierce, and it would not end with the Dutch. The fur trade was never a simple exchange of goods. For native peoples of early New York, the Mohawk, Mayakin, and other members of the Iroquois Confederacy, it was a force that reshaped daily life, altered traditions, and carried both opportunity and tragedy. The arrival of iron tools changed everything. Knives, axes, and kettles replaced stone and bone implements. Firearms gave hunters new power, allowing them to kill more game and defend their villages with greater force. These goods were not luxuries, they became necessities. Native communities began to rely on European trade to maintain their way of life. But dependence carried risk. Once iron tools and firearms became central, tribes needed steady access. Alongside tools and weapons came something far more destructive: disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza spread through native villages. These illnesses, unknown before European contact, killed thousands. Entire communities were reduced to a fraction of their former size. The Mohican, once strong in the Hudson Valley, lost much of their population. The Iroquois Confederacy, though powerful, suffered repeated epidemics. Each outbreak left fewer hunters, fewer warriors, fewer leaders. This decline made tribes more vulnerable. With fewer people, they relied more heavily on trade to survive. Disease and dependence shifted the balance of power. The Mohawk, through alliance with the Dutch and later the English, gained firearms earlier than rivals. This gave them military advantage. They expanded influence, pushing weaker tribes aside. But this power was fragile. It rested on continued access to trade. Without European goods, their strength would falter. The fur trade also changed culture. Traditional crafts declined as iron tools replaced stone. Hunting intensified as beaver pelts became currency. Alcohol, introduced through trade, caused social disruption. Ceremonies and traditions continued, but they were reshaped by new realities. Trade was not only economic, it was cultural. The fur trade gave power, but it also took life. It armed tribes, but it weakened them through disease. It offered wealth, but it created dependence. It gave influence, but it eroded independence. This tension echoed through the years. Native peoples remained central to the fur trade, but they were never free from its consequences. The fur trade in early New York was layered with details that reveal how deeply it shaped society. These facts, often overlooked, show that the trade was not only about pelts, it was about currency, culture, and power. Beaver pelts were so valuable that they became a form of currency in New Netherland. Colonists used them to pay debts, settle accounts, and purchase goods. A single pelt could be exchanged for tools, cloth, or food. In a colony where coinage was scarce, pelts filled the gap. This made the beaver not just an animal, but a foundation of the economy. What happens when the beaver population declines? The answer is that scarcity would later threaten the very system built upon these pelts. The Dutch sometimes paid native hunters with alcohol. At first, it seemed a simple exchange, but alcohol caused deep social problems in native communities. It disrupted traditions, weakened leadership, and created dependency. Colonial records show repeated complaints from native leaders who asked traders to stop offering alcohol. Yet the practice continued because it was profitable. Trade was not only about goods, it was about choices that carried lasting consequences. The Mohawk, part of the Iroquois Confederacy, used fur trade profits to strengthen their military power. With firearms and iron tools purchased through trade, they gained advantage over rival tribes. This power allowed them to expand influence, dominate trade routes, and play a central role in the Beaver Wars. Their rise was not only military, it was economic, built on the wealth of pelts. These details remind us the fur trade was not simple commerce. It was a system that touched every part of life. It shaped economies, altered cultures, and fueled wars. It gave wealth, but it also brought loss. The fur trade was the first major business of New York, but it was also a force that carried both promise and tragedy. The Mohawk and Mohican tribes were rivals. The Mohican controlled trade routes along the Hudson River. The Mohawk wanted dominance. By the 1620s, conflict broke out. The Mohawk attacked the Mohican, pushing them eastward. The Dutch, seeking stability, sided with the Mohawk. This alliance gave the Mohawk access to Dutch firearms. With guns in hand, the Mohawk gained power over rival tribes. What comes next? The Mohawk would not stop at the Mohican. They would expand their influence across the region, reshaping the balance of power. While the Dutch allied with the Mohawk, the French in Canada allied with the Huron. This created a dangerous rivalry: Mohawk versus Huron, Dutch versus French. The fur trade was the prize. Whoever controlled the flow of pelts controlled wealth, and wealth meant survival. By the 1640s, the Mohawk launched raids against the Huron, disrupting French trade. The French responded with military force. Skirmishes spread across the Great Lakes and into New York. The fur trade was no longer a peaceful exchange. It was becoming a war. The English colonies in New England were growing. Traders in Connecticut and Massachusetts wanted fur. They began trading with tribes along the Hudson Valley, challenging Dutch monopoly. The Dutch West India Company tried to stop them, but smuggling was common. English traders slipped into Dutch territory, offering better prices. Native tribes, always seeking advantage, sometimes preferred English goods. Was the Dutch monopoly strong enough to survive, or would English competition break it apart? The rivalry between tribes, fueled by European trade, led to what historians call the Beaver Wars. From the 1640s to the 1660s, the Iroquois Confederacy, led by the Mohawk, fought against rival tribes across the Northeast. Their goal was clear: control the fur trade. With Dutch firearms, the Iroquois attacked the Huron, Erie, Susquehannock, and others. Villages were destroyed, populations collapsed. The consequence? The Iroquois gained dominance, but the cost was high. Thousands died, communities were shattered. The fur trade had turned into a war for survival. We've seen tribes fighting tribes, nations fighting nations, and traders breaking monopolies. But what happens when the English finally take New Netherland from the Dutch? What happens when New Amsterdam becomes New York? That story is coming, but first, let us look at the turning points that made the fur trade a battlefield. Turning points in rivalry. 1628, the Mohawk defeat the Mohican, securing dominance in the Hudson Valley. 1640s, the Beaver Wars begin, spreading conflict across the Northeast. 1664, the English seize New Netherland, renaming it New York. Each turning point shifted control. Each turning point reshaped alliances. And each turning point showed that the fur trade was more than business. It was destiny. Some Dutch traders secretly sold firearms to tribes other than the Mohawk, despite company rules. The Iroquois Confederacy used fur profits to rebuild villages destroyed by war. English traders often disguised themselves as Dutch to enter forts and buy furs illegally. You can find out that rivalry was not only open conflict, it was also hidden schemes, secret deals, and quiet betrayals. The fur trade created wealth, but rivalry created instability. Native tribes were weakened by war and disease. The Dutch struggled to maintain monopoly. The English gained ground. By the mid-17th century, the fur trade had set the stage for a larger conflict, the struggle between Dutch and English for control of New York. In 1664, sails appeared on the horizon. English warships entered the harbor of New Amsterdam. The Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, tried to rally resistance, but the settlers, many weary of the Dutch West India Company's strict monopoly, did not fight. Without a battle, New Netherland became New York. And with that, the fur trade entered a new chapter. The English takeover was not just a change of rulers, it was a turning point in the fur trade. The Dutch had built the system, the English inherited it, but they would reshape it, expand it, and use it to strengthen their empire. Here is the promise. In this chapter, we will see how the English transformed the fur trade, how native alliances shifted, and how New York became the center of a new struggle for wealth and power. Under the Dutch West India Company, trade was tightly controlled. Independent traders often complained. Smuggling was common. When the English arrived, many settlers welcomed them, hoping for freer trade. The English did not abolish control, but they loosened it. Merchants gained more freedom. Trade expanded. New York became a hub not only for furs, but for shipping and commerce. What comes next? With freedom came competition, and competition brought new challenges. The Mohawk, long allied with the Dutch, now faced a choice. Would they trust the English? The answer was yes. The English offered firearms, goods, and promises of support. The Mohawk continued their dominance, now under English protection. But alliances were fragile. The French in Canada still supported the Huron and other tribes. The Beaver Wars continued. The English and French fought indirectly through their native allies. Under English rule, trade routes expanded. Furs flowed not only down the Hudson River, but also through Albany, Schenectady, and into the interior. Albany became the key trading post. Merchants in Albany negotiated directly with native hunters. They offered better prices than New York City traders. This created rivalry between Albany and New York merchants. Here lies the controversy. Who controlled the fur trade? The city merchants or the frontier traders? The debate would last for decades. Major turning points in English control. 1664. English seize New Amsterdam, renaming it New York. 1674. Treaty of Westminster confirms English control after brief Dutch reconquest. 1680s. Albany rises as the center of fur trade, challenging New York City merchants. Each turning point shifted power. Each turning point reshaped the business. The English takeover did not change the basic reality for native tribes. They remained dependent on European goods. They remained vulnerable to disease. They remained caught in rivalry. But the English brought new pressures. They demanded loyalty. They pushed tribes to fight against the French. They used trade as a weapon of empire. Under Dutch rule, trade routes expanded. Furs flowed not only down the Hudson River, but also through Albany, Schenectady, and into the interior. Albany became the key trading post. Merchants in Albany negotiated directly with native hunters. They offered better prices than New York City traders. This created rivalry between Albany and New York merchants. Here lies the controversy. Who controlled the fur trade? The city merchants or the frontier traders? The debate would last for decades. Major turning points in English control. 1664. English seize New Amsterdam, renaming it New York. 1674. Treaty of Westminster confirms English control after brief Dutch reconquest. 1680s. Albany rises as the center of fur trade, challenging New York City merchants. Each turning point shifted power. Each turning point reshaped the business. The English takeover did not change the basic reality for native tribes. They remained dependent on European goods. They remained vulnerable to disease. They remained caught in rivalry. But the English brought new pressures. They demanded loyalty. They pushed tribes to fight against the French. They used trade as a weapon of empire. After 1664, Dutch settlers in New York were allowed to keep their property and continue trading as long as they swore loyalty to the English crown. Albany merchants often acted as intermediaries, translating between native languages and English traders. Beaver pelts continued to serve as a form of currency well into the English period.
We have seen the English takeover, the rise of Albany, and the continuation of native alliances. But what happens when England and France go to war directly? What happens when the fur trade becomes the prize in imperial conflict? That story is coming. In the next chapter, we will see how the fur trade became entangled in the great wars of empire, the battles that would decide the fate of New York and North America. France controlled Canada. England controlled New York. Both wanted the fur trade. Both relied on native allies. The French allied with the Huron and Algonquin. The English allied with the Iroquois Confederacy, especially the Mohawk. This rivalry turned trade into war. Raids, ambushes, and battles spread across forests and rivers. Fur trade was no longer safe. Every shipment of pelts carried risk. Every alliance carried danger. The first major imperial war in North America was King William's War, 1689 to 1697. It was part of a larger European conflict, but in New York it was about fur. French forces with native allies attacked English settlements. The English with Iroquois allies struck back. Albany became a fortress. Traders lived in fear. The consequence? Trade slowed. Villages burned. The fur trade became a weapon of empire. The next war brought more destruction. Queen Anne's War happened in 1702 to 1713, spread across the colonies. In New York, the Iroquois tried to remain neutral, playing English and French against each other. But neutrality was fragile. Raids continued, trade routes were disrupted, merchants struggled to survive. The fur trade was the bloodline of New York, but war threatened to cut that lifeline. The Iroquois Confederacy faced a dilemma. If they sided too strongly with the English, they risked French retaliation. If they sided with the French, they risked losing English support. Their solution was balance. They played both sides, trading with both, negotiating treaties, and maintaining power. This balancing act gave the Iroquois influence, but it also created suspicion. Both English and French doubted their loyalty. The wars weakened trade. Merchants lost profits. Native tribes lost lives. Settlements lived in fear. But the wars also strengthened English control. By 1713, England had gained ground. New York's fur trade was more secure under English rule. The consequence? New York was rising as the center of English power in the region. The fur trade in early New York was deeply tied to the wider struggles of empire. These details, often overlooked, reveal how local merchants, native leaders, and European treaties were all part of a global contest for wealth and power. During King William's War, Albany merchants often armed themselves, turning trading posts into forts. The war brought raids from French forces and their native allies, threatening settlements along the Hudson River. Merchants were not soldiers, but survival demanded defense. Trading houses became fortified structures, with muskets stacked beside bundles of pelts. This shows how fragile trade was. Commerce could collapse overnight if protection failed. What happens when merchants must choose between profit and survival? Some Iroquois leaders secretly sold furs to French traders despite official alliances with the English. This was part of the Iroquois strategy of balance, playing both sides to maintain independence. By trading with the French, they gained access to goods and ensured they were not fully dependent on one empire. But secrecy carried risk. English merchants accused the Iroquois of betrayal. Trust weakened, alliances strained. The Treaty of Utrecht, which ended Queen Anne's War, gave England control of Hudson Bay, Newfoundland, and Acadia. This was more than a territorial gain. It expanded English access to fur. Hudson Bay was a major source of pelts, long contested between French and English traders. With the treaty, England secured dominance in northern trade routes.
For New York, this meant stronger English power in the region. The fur trade was no longer just a local matter. It was tied to treaties signed in Europe, shaping the destiny of colonies across North America. In this period, the fur trade was not only local, it was part of a global struggle. Merchants in Albany,
Native leaders in the Iroquois Confederacy and diplomats in Europe were all connected by the value of beaver pelts. The first business of New York was not isolated. It was woven into the wars, treaties, and rivalries of empires. We have seen the fur trade in the wars of empire, but what happens when peace returns? What happens when trade expands again and New York becomes the center of commerce? That story is coming. In the coming story, we will see how the fur trade shaped New York's growth, how merchants gained wealth, and how the city began its rise as a global hub. Albany became the key hub of the fur trade. Its location on the Hudson River made it the perfect meeting point between native hunters and English merchants. Traders from Albany negotiated directly with the Mohawk and other Iroquois tribes. They offered better prices than New York City merchants. They built trust through personal relationships. Peace allowed trade routes to expand. Hunters traveled deeper into forests. Merchants extended their reach into the Great Lakes. Furs flowed south to Albany, then down the Hudson River to New York City, and finally across the Atlantic to London. The chain was long, but it was strong. What comes next? As trade expanded, wealth grew. And wealth always brings rivalry. Albany merchants gained wealth and influence. They controlled the flow of furs. They negotiated treaties with native tribes. They shaped colonial policy. New York City merchants, however, wanted their share. They argued that Albany had too much power. They lobbied colonial governors to regulate trade. The Iroquois, exhausted by decades of war, welcomed peace. They continued their balancing act, trading with both English and French, but their power was weakening. Disease had reduced their population. Dependence on European goods had grown. Yet they remained central to the fur trade. Without Iroquois hunters, the trade would collapse. Peace allowed trade to flourish. Merchants grew rich. New York grew powerful. But peace also deepened dependence. Native tribes relied more on European goods. Colonists relied more on native hunters. The consequence? The fur trade tied everyone together, but ties can become chains. The prosperity of the fur trade in New York was built not only on large-scale commerce and empire-wide treaties, but also on small, practical details and personal choices. These lesser-known facts reveal how deeply the trade was woven into everyday life, relationships, and the rhythms of survival. Albany merchants often married into native families to strengthen alliances. These marriages were not only personal unions, but also political and economic strategies. By joining families, merchants gained trust, access to trade networks, and protection. For native communities, these ties offered closer connections to goods and influence in negotiations. This blending of families shows how trade was more than business. It was social. Beaver pelts were carefully graded for quality. The best pelts, soft, thick, and durable, were reserved for London markets where demand was highest. Lesser quality pelts were sold locally or shipped to other colonies. Grading was strict. Inspectors examined each pelt, separating prime skins from worn or damaged ones. This system ensured that New York's exports maintained reputation and value abroad. Every pelt carried not only fur, but judgment. Quality determined profit. Some furs were stored in underground cellars in Albany to protect them from dampness before shipment. Moisture could ruin pelts, reducing their value. Merchants built cellars with stone walls and wooden racks, keeping furs dry until they were loaded onto boats for the Hudson River journey. This practice shows the care and effort behind trade. Pelts were not simply gathered and shipped, they were preserved, guarded, and treated as treasure. Albany merchants had the advantage of location. They were close to the Mohawk and other Iroquois tribes. They built trust through direct negotiation. They controlled the flow of furs. New York City merchants, however, had the advantage of shipping. They controlled the ports. They shipped furs to London. They argued that Albany should not monopolize trade. Colonial governors often sided with New York City merchants. They issued regulations requiring Albany traders to sell furs through New York City. They tried to centralize control. But Albany resisted. Merchants continued to trade directly with native hunters. Smuggling grew. The Iroquois Confederacy remained central. They supplied the furs. They negotiated treaties. They balanced English and French interests. But their power was weakening. Population decline continued. Dependence on European goods deepened. Rival tribes challenged their dominance. By the 1740s, tension between England and France was rising again. The fur trade was once more at risk. Raids threatened trade routes. Merchants feared loss. The consequence? Prosperity was fragile. Wealth could vanish overnight. The rivalry between Albany and New York City weakened unity. Merchants fought each other instead of strengthening trade. Colonial policy became inconsistent. Native alliances grew unstable. The consequence? New York was vulnerable. When new wars came, the colony was divided. The rivalry over the fur trade in New York was not only fought in open markets or through colonial policy, it was also shaped by hidden deals, quiet betrayals, and personal choices that rarely appear in official records. These details reveal the shadowy side of commerce, where trust and deception lived side by side. Albany merchants often traveled with native hunters deep into the forests. These journeys were not only about collecting pelts, they were about building trust. By sharing the hardships of travel, eating together, and living briefly in native camps, merchants forged personal bonds that strengthened alliances. This practice gave Albany traders an edge. They were seen not just as distant buyers, but as partners. New York City merchants, far from the forests, relied on political influence. They sometimes bribed colonial governors to secure favorable regulations. These bribes ensured that laws tilted toward city merchants, forcing Albany traders to sell through New York City or restricting their independence. Such corruption was whispered about, but rarely written down. It shows how power in the fur trade was not only earned in forests, it was bought in offices. Some furs were smuggled directly to Boston, bypassing both Albany and New York City. Smugglers sought higher prices or freer trade. This angered both Albany and New York merchants who saw their profits slipping away. Smuggling was risky. If caught, traders faced fines or loss of goods, but the rewards were tempting. In 1754, the forests of New York once again echoed with the sounds of war. Muskets fired, villages burned, and alliances shattered. The French and Indian War had begun, and at its heart, hidden beneath the battles and treaties, lay the fur trade, the first business of New York, now facing its greatest test. We have seen the fur trade rise under the Dutch, transform under the English, expand in peace, and suffer in rivalry. But now comes the climax. The French and Indian War was the largest conflict yet in North America, and the fur trade was both the prize and the victim. The French and Indian War was part of a global conflict, the 7 Years' War. But in New York, it was about land, power, and fur. The French, allied with Huron and Algonquin tribes, sought to control the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley. The English, allied with the Iroquois, sought to expand westward. Albany became the center of English operations. Troops gathered there. Supplies flowed through its forts. Merchants struggled to keep trade alive amid chaos. But trade was dangerous. Native hunters feared raids. Merchants feared loss. The fur trade slowed. The lifeblood of New York was bleeding. The Iroquois Confederacy, long the gatekeepers of the fur trade, faced collapse. Disease had weakened them. War had divided them. Some sided with the English. Some leaned toward the French. Their balancing act failed. Their power declined. Without strong native allies, could the fur trade survive? The war began with small battles in the Ohio Valley in 1754. French forces built forts to secure trade routes, while English colonists pushed westward. Native tribes were caught in the middle, forced to choose sides. For the fur trade, this was the first disruption. Hunters feared traveling. Merchants worried about losing access to pelts. The skirmishes signaled that the forests were no longer safe. 2 years later, the conflict became formal. England and France declared war, turning local skirmishes into global struggle. Troops poured into North America. Forts were attacked. Villages burned. Trade routes collapsed. Merchants in Albany and New York City faced ruin. Native hunters struggled to survive. The fur trade, once steady, was now a victim of empire. The turning point came in 1759 when English forces captured Quebec. French power in North America broke. Without Quebec, France could no longer control trade routes or supply allies. For New York, this was a moment of hope. With French competition weakened, English merchants saw opportunity. The fur trade could recover, but only if peace followed. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. England gained control of Canada, Hudson Bay, and all French territories east of the Mississippi. This was more than a military victory, it was an economic triumph. England now controlled the fur trade across vast lands. New York, already a hub, became central to English commerce in North America. But there was a consequence. With French competition gone, demand for pelts flooded London markets. Prices fell, profits shrank. The fur trade survived, but its golden age was ending. The war devastated the fur trade. Routes were disrupted, hunters were killed, merchants lost fortunes. But the war also ended French competition. With France defeated, England controlled North America. New York's fur trade was secure under English rule. The consequence? The fur trade survived, but it was changed. It was no longer the lifeblood of New York. Farming, shipping, and finance were rising. The fur trade was fading.